Hi people, you're watching The Last Climb. Today you'll see what happened when 4 young influencers let a sponsor deadline decide how fast they climbed Everest, and what that reckless decision brutally cost these girls.
The permits were real, the sponsor was real, and 2 climbing Sherpas were there to keep them safe. But what a marketing deadline put them underneath on that mountain is one of the most terrifying things you will ever hear. It was Thursday, the 25th of April, 2019, in the Khumbu Icefall on the Nepali side of Everest, somewhere above 19,000 feet, where 4 young women from Salt Lake City were still below the upper icefall well after daylight had arrived, while other teams were already descending toward base camp. They had left base camp in the dark with 2 climbing Sherpas on what was meant to be their first real acclimatization rotation after an earlier familiarization day low in the ice, and they were behind schedule from the first ladder. By that spring, Everest had been running as a mature commercial operation for years, since the 2014 icefall avalanche and the 2015 earthquake. The icefall doctors had tried to minimize exposure to the west shoulder where they could, but part of that season's route still passed beneath its threatening seracs, because no viable alternative had ever been found. It was never permanent either way. Ladders, anchors, and stretches of fixed rope changed through the season as the glacier moved underneath them. Contemporary route reports that season described the same trade-off, an attempt to reduce exposure to the west shoulder where possible without ever fully escaping it. It was not a solution, because there is no solution. It is an icefall. What that means in practice is that the safest route through it is still a route through a thing actively coming apart, and timing is one of the most important protections anybody has. You get through it fast, in the cold and the dark, and you do not linger. Everything in this story comes back to that. Their names were Jocelyn Beckstrand, 27, Britta Hafen, 26, Marit Openshaw, 25, and Tenley Gunnell, 24. All from Salt Lake City or the canyons east of it, all working as outdoor content creators based there. Jocelyn had been making outdoor content for 6 years and held the relationship with the gear company that paid for the trip. Merritt shot most of it, and Tenley, the youngest, had joined the content team about a year before. Britta was the only one of the 4 with anything like a mountain record. 2 seasons of guided glacier work in the Cascades, and a season on a Mexican volcano, more than most people have and nothing at all next to what that mountain asks. The campaign materials never marketed them as professional alpinists. What they sold was 4 women, a brand, and the highest mountain on earth in the frame behind them. The permits were real. The spring royalty that season was $11,000 per foreign climber before anybody bought a plane ticket, and the brand paid it for 4 of them. The operator was a small Kathmandu company at the cheaper end of a market that has argued about itself for a decade. The end that will take a deposit from almost anybody. Nepal's permit system did not require applicants to prove a previous high-altitude record, and the operator's own records do not show it asked for one either. It is how the South Side has worked for years, and it is the thing experienced climbers have complained about for most of them.
Helicopters are the part of the story that most people have never heard about, and I need you to understand what they let you skip before we go anywhere near the ice.
A good deal of the arrangement survives because commercial arrangements generate paper. There was a sponsorship agreement signed in January, a fixed sum against a delivery schedule, a campaign launch date written into it, and a list of assets due before that date. There was an invoice for 4 full-service places on a spring Everest expedition, permit royalty, oxygen, tents, food, and 2 assigned climbing Sherpas. There was a separate line for a helicopter charter, Kathmandu to Lukla, for 4 passengers, camera equipment, and essential baggage, subject to payload restrictions. The expedition could not fly the 4 clients directly into base camp as an ordinary commercial transfer, so from Lukla they continued overland, compressing an approach normally spread across roughly 8 to 12 days into less than a week. There was an email thread from March in which somebody at the brand asked whether the trekking days could be compressed, and somebody at the operator answered that they could be flown. Nobody in that thread was being reckless. It reads like every production schedule anybody has ever put together, and that is the problem with it.
Walking in is not the scenic part of an Everest expedition. It is the medicine, and almost nobody knows that until somebody tells them.
Here's what the trek does. Kathmandu sits at about 4,600 feet, Lukla about 9,300, base camp a little over 17,600. The 8 to 12 days people normally spend walking between Lukla and base camp look like the tourist section of the trip, and they are the reason anybody survives the rest of it. You climb a bit, you drop back down, you sleep low, you go again. Namche Bazaar at around 11,300 feet exists in the itinerary as 2 nights of doing very little, and those nights are treatment, not a rest stop. Over those days, the body adjusts through increased ventilation, dehydration, shifts in fluid balance, and longer-term changes to the blood, all of which keep a person functional in thin air. Skip it, and you leave yourself less acclimatized than somebody who walked up and slept progressively higher in a place where the available oxygen pressure is roughly half sea level. Reduced acclimatization does not guarantee altitude illness, but it raises the risk. Acute mountain sickness is the common problem at altitude, usually miserable rather than dangerous. Fluid in the lungs and swelling in the brain are separate and much rarer illnesses that can develop during a rapid ascent, and either can kill a healthy person in under a day. None of the four was ever diagnosed with either. What being less acclimatized plausibly did was leave them able to function at base camp while still poorly prepared for strenuous climbing higher up. The helicopter from Kathmandu to Lukla is routine, legal, and used by a large share of trekkers every season. What is not routine is what these four did after landing there, covering in under a week an approach most parties spend 8 to 12 days on. There is a version of a compressed itinerary that is fine and one that is not, and the difference is not the helicopter, it is what somebody does with the days it buys them.
Brands can put a deadline on a campaign, but nobody can put one on a mountain. And it legitimately frustrates me that nobody at that company understood what they were asking.
What the group put out during those days is still findable, and it is the most ordinary set of pictures anybody will ever look at. There is the four of them at the domestic terminal in Kathmandu with duffels and coffee. There is the inside of the helicopter, headsets on, everybody laughing at the noise. There is a shot out of the window of terraced hillside going past, and then of the valley opening out toward white ground. There is one taken at Lukla itself, the famous short runway behind them at an angle. There are several from the days on foot after that, suspension bridges over the Dud Kosi, prayer flags at Namche, a shot of the whole group grinning under the sign at the edge of the Khumbu, each one time-stamped a little higher and a little further along than the last. And then there is base camp, on the day they finally walked in under their own power, tents and rows on the moraine, the icefall standing behind them like something poured and then frozen mid-movement, 4 people in brand new down jackets with the tags barely off. The caption on that one says they made it in under a week. The comments underneath it are hundreds of people saying how lucky they were. The base camp clinic at the height of the season is a couple of tents and a handful of volunteer doctors, one of the more remarkable pieces of medicine anywhere on Earth. It treats climbers, staff, and visitors for a wide range of problems every season: altitude, illness, respiratory complaints, trauma, frostbite, and more. Arrival altitude sickness is one of the things it sees constantly, and the people there recognize it fast. Trekkers arriving by air and coming through the door within hours looking gray. 2 of the 4 reported a headache to the physician in the first 48 hours, and 1 reported difficulty sleeping. The 4th had no recorded complaint. The operator's own intake paperwork noted the compressed itinerary, and the physician saw the group on the strength of it, exactly the kind of arrival the clinic exists for. The physician advised against rapid further ascent and documented conservative guidance in the log. The clinic note and the expedition log both show that they remained at base camp for the next 4 days on that advice, though 4 days at that altitude did not erase the acclimatization they had skipped on the approach. It only gave them time to stabilize before attempting the first rotation. This is the part where the story stops being about carelessness. They did not ignore the doctor or their Sherpas. One clinic note reads, "Headache resolved by the 4th day. That kind of improvement is real, and 4 days at that altitude could resolve a mild headache without providing the more gradual acclimatization normally built during a conventional approach, since that varies a great deal from person to person." The distinction between resolving symptoms and acclimatizing is the whole medical spine of this story, and it is almost impossible to feel from the inside. A person who has flown in and rested can be perfectly comfortable at base camp and still be nowhere near ready to work hard above it, because resting and performing at altitude are 2 different tests, and only the first one is easy to pass.
It hit me like a truck when Susan said losing a client seems to leave these Sherpas traumatized, because every single one of you watching has lost someone or something too. And you're about to meet a Sherpa who understands that better than anyone.
The icefall is the reason people who know Everest talk about that mountain quietly. It is the bottom section of the south side route, a frozen river the width of the valley that moves several feet a day, and there is no way around it. Every spring, the Icefall Doctors, a dedicated team of Nepali specialists, establish that season's route with fixed rope and aluminum ladders, and maintain it all season, because the ice keeps moving underneath what they built the day before. There are ladders laid flat across crevasses, sometimes 2 or 3 lashed end to end, and others standing upright against walls of ice. Above all of it stands Siracs, towers of ice the size of buildings, simply there and occasionally not. Nobody clears them, stabilizes them, or predicts them, and everyone who crosses that ice does so knowing it. In April of 2014, a Sarek released off the west shoulder and killed 16 Nepali workers carrying loads through at the time. The route shifted after that, further from the west shoulder and more through the middle, a change that was real without ever being permanent, because the route kept changing every season, as the glacier did. What has never changed is the clock. Ice is at its most stable when it is coldest, so teams leave base camp somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning and want to be out of the top of the icefall before the sun gets properly onto it. Their first outing on the ice, a low familiarization day rather than a full rotation, went badly and survivably, the way those days often do for beginners. They went up into the lower icefall, turned around partway, and came back to base camp. The Sherpas assigned to them were experienced men, and one of them, Tashi Norbu, 39, from Thame, was the lead climbing Sherpa responsible for the group, with several Everest summits and 11 seasons of work on that mountain behind him. His account afterward was the most detailed thing anybody had. He said the 4 were slow on the ladders, completely normal for people who had never crossed one, and that he expected to spend the season getting them faster. He also said that the schedule they were working to did not leave time for that. The launch date was fixed and the assets were due. The plan on paper had them doing a second rotation to Camp 1 and Camp 2 within days of the first, aggressive for anybody and close to meaningless for 4 people who had arrived the way they did. It is worth saying what a normal rotation schedule looks like. Most commercial teams spend weeks going up and back, Camp 1, Camp 2, the Lhotse face, rest days between each and a trip down to thicker air in the middle. The point is not fitness, it is blood. These 4 had 2 weeks blocked out and a delivery date at the end.
Dark is not a style choice on that mountain, it is the safety system, and by the time these 4 were still out there, that system had already failed them.
There is a photograph from the puja, the ceremony every team holds before anybody sets foot on the ice. Juniper smoke and rice and prayer flags going up on the pole. All 4 of them are in it, and so are both Sherpas. There is a clip from the practice session on the low ice above camp, somebody halfway across a horizontal ladder with both arms out, and laughter on the audio. There is a photograph of 4 pairs of boots outside a tent, and one of a crate of oxygen bottles with a tarpaulin half off it. There is one of a bowl of noodles in the mess tent with somebody's gloves beside it. And there is a series from the small hours of the 25th, headlamps in a line on the moraine, frost on a pack, a hand on a fixed line in the dark. The metadata on the last of them places it at approximately 6:30 in the morning, and it is the last recovered image from any of the 4 devices. What is known about that morning comes from Tashi Norbu, the second climbing Sherpa, radio traffic into base camp, and the teams who passed them in the dark. The 6 of them left camp at around 2:30, which is normal. Everything after it was not. The 4 clients had crossed ladders twice in their lives, once on the practice ice above camp and once on the familiarization day, and that season's icefall had unusually few ladders even by icefall standards, but the handful of crossings that did exist still forced everyone into the same narrow points, over gaps a person cannot see the bottom of. Climbers who passed them lower down remembered a group moving slowly and stopping a long time at the crossings, though they do not agree on how many times or exactly where. Some of that was the group and some was the icefall itself, since a ladder takes 1 person at a time and a slow party ahead becomes everybody's delay. 2 other teams passed them. By around 5:30, they had cleared the football field and were into the upper section, a point most teams clear before daylight, and Tashi Norbu called base camp on the radio. The operator's base camp radio log records him reporting the group was slow and asking whether to turn them around, and that the decision was left to him. He kept them going up. They had already crossed most of the difficult terrain below. The exit above was now closer than base camp behind them, and descending the ladders exhausted carried its own real hazard for people who had barely learned to cross one. He later said that reasoning was why he judged it faster to get 4 exhausted people out the top than to send them back down through everything already crossed. A judgment experienced climbers still argue about. There is a real case for it. There is also the case everybody makes afterward, which is that there was still a strong argument for holding them at a wider, less exposed section until they had recovered, rather than pushing on.
Brynna Haffen had more experience on ice than the other 3 did, and I think about that more than anything else in this story.
Her own messages are the strangest document in the whole thing. There are messages from Britta to a friend in Salt Lake from the days at base camp. They repeatedly mention the compressed approach, the short acclimatization period, the clinic's advice, and the approaching campaign deadline. She wrote that she had raised the scheduling concern, but the expedition was continuing anyway. 2 days before the rotation, she wrote that she was still going up. That is the whole of it, and it is the part nobody wants to hear.
Deadlines were pushing this trip from the very start, and I think that is true of more expedition disasters than people realize.
The morning of the 25th was clear enough for movement, with no storm pushing through, but temperatures were already rising as the morning went on, which was one of the reasons teams tried to minimize their time in the icefall. That is worth saying because people expect a storm in a story like this, and there was not one. What there was, by 6:30, was 4 clients and 2 Sherpas in the upper icefall in daylight, on a route everybody on the mountain treats as a managed passage rather than a safe one, somewhere to be through rather than to be. Daylight had reached the upper icefall, and the season's warmth was one of the risk factors teams were already watching, not a cause anybody could point to afterward. Toshinorbu said afterward that he had begun moving them faster and that they could not go faster, and that he had already decided the rotation itself was over, that this would be the last push before Camp 1, rather than a real second attempt anytime soon. He was leading. The second Sherpa was at the back of the line. The 4 women moved individually along the fixed lines between them, clipped in with their own gear. 3 accounts placed Jocelyn Beckstrand ahead of the other 3, and Tenley Gunnell at the rear during the final documented section, in the order they had used since the practice ice, although investigators could not establish that the order held for the entire climb. What happened next is not in dispute in its shape and cannot be reconstructed in its detail. The surviving accounts placed the collapse sometime between approximately 6:30 and 7 in the morning, when a large ice collapse came down from the Sarek field above the section of route they were on. Though no surviving witness could identify the exact block, Toshinorbu was out in front and slightly higher, across a crevasse crossing, caught at the edge of it and buried to the chest. He said he heard it before he saw anything and had time to get his arms up and no time for anything else. It took him some minutes to get himself out, and he sustained severe cold and crush injuries to both hands that required evacuation and prolonged treatment. The second Sherpa later said he was further back and lower, and was knocked down but not buried. Teams below heard it and saw the powder cloud come down through the towers, and radio calls reached base camp within minutes from more than one team, though their accounts of the location and sequence did not entirely agree. No surviving witness reported a continuous view of the group at the moment of the release. In the icefall, you are surrounded by towers and folds of ice, and there are sections where a climber cannot see much beyond the next feature.
Toshinorbu freed himself from that ice and immediately started searching for his clients, and they had to pull him off the search once they saw how badly his hands were hurt, and I have thought about that longer than any other part of this.
The response was as fast as anything gets up there, which is not the same as fast. Sherpas and climbers already in the icefall moved toward the debris field as the radio reports reached base camp, and more came up as conditions allowed, because in the Khumbu, the people already there are the rescue. They dug where the route had been and where the debris ran out, in blocks of ice the size of cars, on ground that shifted twice. Other Sherpas moved the second man to a point where extraction was viable, and a helicopter lifted him out once the pilot confirmed the aircraft could operate there and the ground team secured the site. Toshinorbu came down to base camp on foot with 2 men either side of him. The digging went on that day, the next, and in reduced form for most of a week, until the icefall doctors and the expedition leaders on site concluded it was no longer safe. Some of what that mountain takes it does not give back. Most of the rescuers had no personal relationship with the 4 women. They were Sherpas from other expeditions whose own seasons ended that morning, and route workers who had been through that section 100 times, and they worked in a place that could have done the same thing to them at any point in the days it took.
Content was the reason 4 people were on that ice in daylight, and I want to be careful here, because the easy version of this story is a lie.
Here is the honest accounting of how this is known, because it matters more than the story does. Nobody saw the release from a position that could describe it, and this account will not pretend otherwise. What exists is a set of fixed points. There is Toshinorbu, who was closest and lived, and whose account was taken at base camp and again in Kathmandu after his hands were treated. There is the second climbing Sherpa's separate account. There are the climbers from the teams that passed them in the dark, who gave times and positions and do not entirely agree about either. There is the operator's base camp log, an entry rather than a recording with the radio call noted in it. There are the photographs recovered from the devices that came back, metadata placing the last at approximately 6:30, and the witness and radio accounts placing the group in the upper icefall around that time. There is the sponsorship agreement, obtained by the family's attorney during a later review of company records, the operator's invoice, and the March email thread recovered from retained correspondence. There are Britta Hafen's messages, which her friend gave to the families. And there is the Nepali authorities' record of the recovery. Everything past that is a reconstruction, and that word deserves saying plainly. It means the checkable pieces got laid side by side until they made a shape, and then it stopped. What it does not give is the moment, the order, or whether any of them saw it coming. Nobody knows what was said on that rope, because the only person positioned to hear it was face down in ice, and in a later interview, Tashi Norbu said he remembered nothing of the sound except the first crack.
Jocelyn Beckstrand, Britta Hafen, Marit Openshaw, and Tenley Gunnell all died in the Khumbu icefall on the morning of the 25th of April, on their first serious acclimatization rotation on Everest, on a stretch of route thousands have crossed safely before and since.
3 bodies were recovered over the course of that week. The 4th woman remained buried, and authorities recorded her death as presumed, based on the reconstruction and the location of the collapse, rather than a recovered body. A sentence that means something specific and terrible to anybody who has had somebody go missing on that mountain. For the 3 recovered women, examinations were consistent with fatal trauma and burial, and exact injuries and times of death could not be established in every case. The available evidence did not identify a failure of the fixed ropes, ladders, or the women's personal equipment. The available records did not identify any specific failure in the conduct of the 2 Sherpas, both of whom did what men in their position are expected to do, one of them permanently injured doing it. What the record does establish is a chain, and it is not complicated. They arrived with substantially less acclimatization than climbers who had spent days or weeks approaching and sleeping progressively higher. Their rapid approach was one plausible contributor to the slow pace multiple witnesses recorded, which meant they remained in the icefall later into the morning than the teams that had passed them, increasing their exposure to daytime warming and overhead hazards. And being in the icefall in daylight is the one variable on that entire mountain that everybody, every year, agrees about. Nothing in the investigation suggested any of the 4 behaved recklessly on the ice. They were clipped in order, following the 2 men in front of and behind them, doing exactly what they had been told to do. The March email thread documents the scheduling pressure that preceded the climb. It cannot establish that the schedule caused the ice to release, only that it shaped where the group was when it did.
Seracs do not aim at anybody, and that is the part I need you to realize, because there is no version of this where the mountain was making a point.
The brand pulled the campaign and never ran a frame of it. The families later gave the recovered messages and photographs to the investigating team, which is the extent to which anybody outside knows what happened. The available records show no criminal prosecution or permit violation, which should bother people rather than reassure them. The operator continued operating. Tashi Norbu did not return to the icefall. His subsequent expedition records show no further work above base camp, and he was not listed on any roster the following spring. He spoke about it once, briefly. What has been quoted from him is not about the ice at all, and it is not about the brand either. It is that he had told them the season was long and there was time. The account attributed no blame to the women or the brand, and was about the whole arrangement rather than the 4 of them. 4 young women were flown from Kathmandu into the Khumbu in about an hour, and long before that flight ever landed, the operator and the brand had already built the whole trip around a deadline.
Thanks for watching today's episode. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so we can keep making more. You want to drop a comment, more than happy to converse. Oh, and make sure you like the video. We appreciate it. See you next time.